What are your thoughts on the FAO's Livestock's Long Shadow report that states the livestock industry is responsible for 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions?
There are many ways of calculating how livestock has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and the estimates vary from very low figures, around 14%, as in a 2013 report from FAO, to an astonishingly high 51% in a report by Robert Goodhart and Jeff Anhang from Worldwatch. This is not surprising because there are many ways of calculating the impacts of livestock production and meat consumption on greenhouse gas emissions, depending on whether you take into account the land shifts that are taking place to produce maize and soybean to feed animals, the fertilizers and pesticides production required to cultivate those crops, the transport, processing, packaging, conservation of meat between production and consumption, and of course the use of machinery in livestock production may or may not be taken into account depending on your accounting method. The bottom line, however, is that all the estimates show how absolutely vital this sector is for us to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to reduce, therefore, global warming. And even the lowest estimates show how important it is to shift to plant-based diets and reduce livestock production, especially livestock developed according to industrial methods that have the most severe environmental impacts.
So the FAO report tackling climate change through livestock was written by livestock specialists and not environmental assessment experts. Could you comment on this?
The FAO report that estimates that about 14% of total man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from the livestock sector was prepared within the FAO by specialists of agriculture and livestock production, not by environmentalists or specialists of the environmental issues associated with agricultural production. However, they do pledge to take into account the guidelines that the Intergovernmental Panel of Experts on Climate Change have written to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. I believe that a more serious concern, of course, is that the International Meat Association was involved in preparing the report, which in a way is unavoidable because they have the best data on where meat is produced and according to which methods, with which potential impacts on the environment and on greenhouse gases emissions in particular, but which on the other hand does raise the question of the independence with which the study was prepared. And unfortunately, the FAO does not have, like the World Health Organization, for example, very clear guidelines as to which involvement of the private sector is allowable or not in preparing studies. So conflicts of interests are not totally avoided in the preparation of such studies.
The Worldwatch Institute's report by Robert Goodland and Jeff Anhang of the World Bank put livestock global greenhouse gas emissions at 51%, which is obviously considerably higher than the UN report. Would you care to comment on this?
The estimates as to how livestock production is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions vary widely from study to study. A recent study by the FAO from 2013 puts the figure at 14.5% of total man-made greenhouse gas emissions for which livestock is responsible. Other studies, such as a study by two experts from the World Bank, Robert Goodland and Jeff Anhang, prepared for the Worldwatch Institute, puts that figure much higher at 51%. Now, these differences should not be surprising to us because there are different methodologies by which we can assess the impact of livestock production. For example, we all agree that we should take into account the huge amounts of maize and soybean we produce to feed animals in industrial livestock production. That means deforestation. That also means producing fertilizers and pesticides for those crops to be grown. We also know that we may have to take into account the huge energy that it requires to transport the crops from where they're produced to where they're fed to animals, that we may need to take into account the energy used to process the meat, to package it, to preserve it, to transform it in order to make it ready for consumption. And so there are different ways to estimate the impact of livestock production on greenhouse gas emissions. But the bottom line is all the experts who studied this issue agree on one thing: the impact is enormous, and shifting to plant-based diets will make a tremendous difference in our ability to mitigate climate change.
There are huge government subsidies going to the livestock industry. How can this subsidy flow be used to reduce greenhouse gases from the industry as opposed to driving climate change?
It's remarkable that despite all the negative impacts from livestock production and indeed from the increased levels of meat consumption, particularly in rich countries, that are at least 3 times higher than what nutritionists recommend, we continue to subsidize that industry, inter alia by subsidizing access to cheap fossil energies that are needed for industrial livestock production. So subsidies should be used in a much better and more targeted fashion to support grass-fed livestock raising, to support agroecological methods of producing meat, which means a much more harmonious relationship to the ecosystems and perhaps with a maintenance of permanent pastures that can stock the carbon, but means less intensive grazing and less intensive livestock raising. And I also believe that subsidies should support ways of producing meat that do not make us sick and unhealthy, particularly by the use of non-therapeutic antibiotics. Every year in the world, 700,000 people die because of infections that cannot be treated by antibiotics because these people have consumed meat that was treated with high doses of antibiotics in industrial livestock production chains. So it is very problematic, and these subsidies could be used much more efficiently to reward much more sustainable production methods.
How many more people would we be able to feed by shifting crops away from animal feed to feeding humans instead, as humans shift towards a more plant-based diet?
Using land and water to produce large amounts of cereals to feed animals and then consuming the meat and dairy products that result from animal products being sold is highly inefficient. And that is because we need large amounts of crops of cereals to produce meat. At least 6-7 kilograms of cereals, for example, for 1 kilogram of beef. At least 15,000 liters of water for 1 steak, which means that, to take an image a friend used once, you need a small swimming pool to produce 4 steaks, if you wish, to give you an idea. So if we shifted to more plant-based diets, we could indeed significantly increase the availability of cereals for human consumption. And it is estimated that about 3 billion more people could be fed if we cut by half our consumption of animal products. So that is very significant indeed.
So livestock consumes 50% of the world's grain and 80% of the world's soy, but produces only 13% of the world's calories. Could you comment on the efficiency of this system?
The experts today estimate that the consumption of meat and dairy products shall continue to rise in the future, and even faster than the population itself, because people have moved to cities, they change their diets, the rising middle class in developing countries is consuming more meat and dairy products. So the estimate is that between 2010 and 2050, we shall increase the production of meat to respond to this demand by some 70%, which is enormous. And by 2050, the estimate today is that we shall have some 35 billion chickens, for example, which we shall be producing. That is simply unsustainable. And although we can accept that in some developing countries, the consumption of animal products may rise in the future to some degree, clearly in rich countries and even in transition economies such as in China and Brazil and other such places, we need to reduce meat consumption and certainly stem the rise of meat consumption. And the reason for this is it simply cannot be accepted that 40%, perhaps more, of the total cereal production goes to feeding animals. This already uses some 70% of the land surface that is dedicated to agricultural production, 30% of the total land mass, simply to produce for feedstock, and that is entirely unsustainable.
A UNESCO report in 2015 stated that a global water shortfall of 40% is expected by 2030, with the livestock industry being responsible for 27% of the total human water footprint. With the challenges of climate change, how can we ensure food and water security in the future?
So one usually underestimated impact of livestock production is the huge amounts of fresh water required for that production to be maintained and to be increased. In part, this is for the animals themselves, but mostly it is for irrigating the maize, the soybean that we feed animals with. And that has indeed a huge impact on the availability of fresh water in many regions that are already under stress, in which large amounts of water, up to 30% of fresh water, is dedicated to producing feedstock for animals. That is extremely problematic. We need 15,000 liters of water for 1 kilogram of beef. We need a small swimming pool, in fact, for 4 stecks. So that is simply not sustainable. And we need to, for that reason also, shift to plant-based diets in order to make it sustainable, given that fresh water will be increasingly scarce in some regions, as agricultural production shall compete with the needs of households, the needs of the industry, and other users of water.
Could you talk a little bit about food security and how it's related to animal agriculture?
Today, the FAO estimates that about 815 million people are undernourished, do not have enough calories per day to lead healthy and active lives. I believe this is an underestimate, but the reality is in many developing countries, hunger is still a problem. And although it's been decreasing in terms of the percentage of the population concerned, it still is very high in absolute numbers. Now, given population growth and the urbanization of lifestyles, the demand for food shall continue to increase. And so the need is there to use our resources much more efficiently than in the past. And to do this, we need to avoid diverting too much cereals to feeding animals, because that is a very inefficient use of land and water. One problematic dimension here is that we have developed global markets for agricultural products, so that the purchasing power in OECD countries, for example, allows us, rich countries, to command the use of resources in poor countries because the purchasing power of those populations is much lower. And this explains that, for example, we use huge amounts of land in Brazil, Argentina, and other places to produce crops for animal feed when the local communities may need the land for their own food needs. And that is also the case in many parts of Africa. So this global competition for the use of resources, this unfair competition between populations with widely diverging purchasing powers, is to me a very serious source of concern.
Has the livestock industry already exceeded sustainability thresholds for climate change?
Scientists address the question of sustainability by using the concept of planetary boundaries. In other terms, the thresholds that we cannot cross without moving into a very uncertain and risky area. And the 4 areas where these planetary boundaries are already crossed are biodiversity loss, climate change, shifts in land use, and the nitrogen cycle. And in all these 4 areas, livestock production has played a major role, especially if you take into account the production of feed for animals by the development of large monocultures of maize and soybean in particular to feed cattle. So this is why livestock has an impact on the environment that goes far beyond the greenhouse gas emissions that result from enteric fermentation and methane and from deforestation. It has an impact on a range of other issues linked to industrial agricultural production needed to feed animals.
Hypothetically speaking, how would a global shift towards a plant-based diet help the environment?
To move to sustainable food production and consumption, there are three tools we can use. First, a massive redirection of efforts towards organic and agroecological ways of producing food that use fewer inputs, that therefore depend much lesser on fossil energies. Secondly, we can reduce food waste significantly. Today, about 1/3 of the food that we produce is lost at field level or wasted at different segments of the food chains. And thirdly, we need to move to plant-based diets. Reducing our meat consumption by 50% is possible and would make a huge difference in the ecological footprint of our food production and consumption. And it can be done. Consider the huge differences between how much meat and dairy products we consume in affluent countries and how little meat is consumed in other regions, particularly in poor developing countries. For example, in the US, the average American consumes 120 kilograms per year per person. In Niger, they consume 12, maybe 15 kilograms per year per person. And that figure is about similar in India, in part because of cultural and religious reasons. In China, they are at about 60 kilograms per year per person. And in Europe, we are at about 100 kilograms per year per person. So the differences are immense between regions, and in rich countries, we could decrease by 2/3 at least our consumption of meat.
Could you talk about the effects of deforestation related to animal agriculture?
A significant reason why livestock production has been having such a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions is because of the large surfaces of forests that have been destroyed in order to make room for pastures and sometimes for the growth of soybean and maize for feedstock production. And the impacts have been particularly significant in the Amazon region. In Brazil, Argentina, very large amounts of land were deforested in order to stimulate livestock production. And deforestation has, amongst its major explanations, the growth of demand for meat at a global level.
Do you think that the animal agriculture industry has too much influence over policymaking within most governments?
Democracy is really a key part of the solution. And today, democracy does not always function as well as it should because of the huge influence that agribusiness corporations and livestock producers in particular exercise on decision making. For example, in 2015, figures show that the agribusiness corporations in the US spent $130 million trying to influence congresspersons voting on Capitol Hill for various legislative reforms. This is far more than the defense industry, and it is 3 times more than what workers' associations could spend on lobbying politicians in the US. So it is a serious source of concern, and if we have any doubt about how powerful this influence is, we can recall that, for example, when the Advisory Committee on Dietary Guidelines in the US made recommendations to the US government as to how dietary guidelines should be shaped, they were blocked by this very powerful lobby of agribusiness interests.
And in Europe, do livestock agribusiness corporations have similar powerful influence?
In Europe, agribusiness corporations have a huge influence on political decision-making. And those influencing politics are not small farmers producing on small surfaces of land and working according to sustainable agroecological methods. They are the big players who rely on industrial modes of production, who feed long supply chains and serve the global markets and are more competitive and thus can boast that they are the ones that shall be able to win over export markets for the EU. And to me, the most striking example of the influence they can exercise was how they managed to convince the governments of the EU to allow the continuous use of glyphosate-based herbicides, Roundup in particular, despite all the warning signs that were received concerning the impacts on consumers' health of the use of glyphosate in food production. And that was a very clear illustration of the huge influence that these big players from the agribusiness industry could exercise on decision-making.
So governments appear to be placing the interests of some of the most destructive industries first, before planetary emergencies such as climate change, water and food security, which obviously lead to wars, conflict, environmental refugees. Could you comment on this?
Governments find it very difficult to challenge an industry that is so highly concentrated and thus so powerful in its ability to block reform. Tyson Foods, for example, which is probably the most important meat production company in the world, represents an annual turnover of $37 billion. And that money, which means jobs and a huge economic sector depending on that single corporation, means it's very difficult to adopt regulatory reforms that run against those interests. It's a company that is not just too big to fail, but even too big to be ignored by lawmakers if they do not want to lose the very important support of that company that in some cases they depend on even financially. So for me, democracy is really key, and the ability for people to better control how legislation is adopted and how the regulatory reforms are implemented is absolutely vital.
What would you say to people on how we can bring about change?
The livestock industry shall not change unless consumers send very strong signals that they want change. This means changing how we eat and, in fact, replacing animal products, meat in particular, with other ingredients that provide the same nutritious qualities and benefits. For example, leguminous plants, peas, chickpeas can provide, lentils provide proteins that are of much better quality with a much less significant ecological impact than the consumption of animal products. So we need to change our ways of eating, but also to teach ourselves how to cook vegetarian dishes, and we need to move away from a meat-based culture in diets that is still very dominant in rich countries and which in developing countries is seen as a sign of affluence. Once one joins the middle class, one changes one's ways of eating and households shift to consuming more meat and dairy products. And that is a culture, a representation of what it means to eat healthily that must be changed.
How do you see meat production being reduced, and what benefits will it have?
The livestock industry shall not change on its own motion. It shall only change if it is forced to do so. And consumers have a major role to play in this respect by sending a message that they want a different type of consumption, one that is less meat-based and one that relies less on animal products more generally. That is not only good for the environment, because of course it will significantly reduce the ecological footprint of our diets. It's also something that is good for one's health. We already consume far too much meat. We could reduce by 2/3 in rich countries our consumption of animal products, and that would be better for our health. It would avoid a range of cardiovascular diseases and stem the growth of obesity. And meat can be very easily replaced by other types of protein, particularly from chickpeas or lentils and other leguminous plants that provide high quality proteins that are actually better for the environment and also better for human health. So ultimately, the consumer has a huge power to bring about a transformation that politicians may be slow to impose on the industry.